Hey folks, this is Kelani. What's the most exciting piece of loot to usually come out of any type of content these days? No, not the weapons, though they're pretty exciting too. It's definitely not the Azeroth armor either, although that will hopefully get a bit better as we go through more and more raid tiers. No, I'm talking about the trinkets. Usually most of the interesting, exciting, or just downright weird effects that come from gear are more often than not tacked onto some of the trinkets. Sadly, Uldir didn't really have that many trinkets that made you go, wow, that's really cool. Actually, I don't think Uldir had any trinkets that had that kind of effect. I guess it also didn't help that the power level of most Uldir trinkets wasn't that great compared to a lot of the dungeon trinkets currently available, which made them even less exciting if you did happen to see one drop. But we were promised that things should be a little more interesting going into the next raid tier when we tackle the Battle of Dazar'alor. Hopefully that means some powerful trinkets which are also interesting in the way they work. If we're all hunting some higher item level dungeon trinkets, even though the new raid tier is out, that's going to feel pretty lame. So why don't we have a look at the trinkets on offer? Let's kick things off with the DPS trinkets because they're usually the most interesting. The first one we have to look at is Crest of Pacu. This trinket is a little special in that it has a bonus effect which can be made use of while out in the world, or at least in Zuldazar if you're Horde, because I think that's the only place that Pacu has statues. You can happily zip straight to a Pacu totem by using this trinket. While it's an interesting effect, I doubt anyone will really use it. The trinket itself is an intellect trinket with a haste and speed proc. We're looking at everything on Mythic, so you should see some of the higher values that are possible on these items, and while numbers tuning probably isn't final, 370 haste really doesn't sound like a lot. Neither does 117 speed. Is that even going to make a difference with movement speed? It is a 15-second buff duration, so that might explain the lower proc number, but with other haste trinkets like Ignition Mage's Fuse from dungeons being so powerful, I doubt any raid haste trinket will compete without some hefty procs or effects. We're not off to a great start, but we have plenty of trinkets to look at. There's 13 in total from the next raid tier. Up next is the Incandescent Sliver, another piece with intellect. For every 2 seconds while no allies are within 5 yards of you, you gain a stack of crit. These stacks have no duration, but if you walk within 5 yards of an ally, you lose a stack. The stacks cap out at 10, so 280 crit right now for the maxed out potential of that effect, and at 10 stacks you also gain 87 mastery. Again, not amazing numbers there, so I would assume numbers tuning is far from done, so let's focus on the effects instead of the raw numbers, because that's where the interesting stuff is going to happen anyways. This one is really cool, and I can already hear the min-maxers screaming at people on Discord that someone ran over them and they lost all their stacks. I can also hear the giggles from the troublemakers purposefully chasing people with this trinket. There's another little twist though. Any player who also has this trinket won't cause you to lose stacks. So if every intellect user has this trinket, you could all just stack up in your own little corner of the encounter space and not have to worry. This is definitely a more interesting one, but I wonder how many bosses and encounters will allow you to make good use of it. Stacking up is usually pretty important for a variety of reasons, but definitely a step up from just another proc trinket. And then we have the Tidestorm Codex, another intellect trinket. We'll get to all the others in good time, don't worry, but this one is one of the first of many AoE trinkets. These AoE trinkets also have a little bit of a twist too. Typically an AoE trinket in Battle for Azeroth will say it splits damage between all enemies, and while the new raid trinkets also say that, the damage dealt will increase if you strike multiple enemies. So instead of being the same DPS overall for single target and AoE, these items will be better when used in AoE scenarios. The first thing that comes to my mind for that is that these trinkets are going to be amazing for dungeons, because you're always pulling as much trash as you can handle, at least when you're trying to push keys. I wonder how these new AoE effects are going to impact dungeon runs, but we won't be able to see how that plays out until we actually get our hands on this, so let's get back to the trinket itself. It is an on-use effect. You unleash a wave of 6 Tide Elementals that crash into your target, each exploding for AoE damage. It's on a 1.5 minute cooldown, so hopefully that lines up with a bunch of ad spawns and encounters or some of your cooldowns. I'd say that's definitely a little more interesting, but the potential power of this trinket is probably going to be the major reason to cross your fingers that one drops for you. That's all the intellect DPS trinkets we have so far. Let's move on to some strength stuff. Here we have the Everchill Anchor. Your damaging melee abilities apply Everchill, which deals frost damage over time and reduces your target's movement speed by 2%, stacking up to 10 times. So hopefully a decent damage over time effect, which will keep ticking on whatever you can keep attacking, and a 20% passive slow. Not super interesting sadly, which means that it's going to come down to strictly numbers to decide whether this one is worth picking up, or if it's just another shard waiting to drop. This next one is a bit more interesting. Groans Primal Rage is a strength trinket with an on-use effect. You enter a Primal Rage, hello Winston, dealing physical damage split amongst enemies within 8 yards over 4 seconds. Once again, the damage is increased if you hit multiple enemies, but the key part of this trinket, you cannot move or use abilities during the duration of the effect. If anyone played during Legion, and specifically while the Nighthold was all the rage, this should look like a very familiar effect. It's more or less the Draft of Souls, which makes me think it's going to be just as strong for all the same reasons, but I think it's going to depend on how your class works. Draft of Souls was amazing for anyone who could stack a bunch of cooldowns together and push the trinket. In a word, that was warriors. They could also make the entire thing have 100% crit chance. It was absurd. So absurd that the trinket remained one of their best until well into the next raid tier. I hope they wouldn't make the same mistake again, and we don't really have any classes which can stack all of their cooldowns in a single button thanks to the GCD changes. So where does that leave this new trinket? If you have any large damage throughput cooldown, it should be pretty good. If you have any large chunks of downtime in your rotation, say 4 seconds, I think it will end up being even better. This is an item with a lot of potential because its baseline damage is probably going to be the highest out of all the AoE trinkets in this raid, due to that 4-second period where you just can't do anything but let it do its thing. I'm looking forward to seeing what this one can do for sure. The last strength trinket on offer is the Rampaging Amplitude Gigavolt Engine, which is definitely a mouthful. This looks like a mage fuse but for strength users instead. You gain haste and speed, stacking up to 30 times over 10 seconds, you get stacks faster as the engine accelerates, and it runs for a total of 18 seconds. So if you gain all 30 stacks over 10 seconds, which by the way is a huge amount of haste and speed when fully stacked, that's what I like to see, but if it stacks up to max in 10 seconds and runs for 18, that sounds like you're going to have 8 seconds of playtime with that huge buff. 8 seconds might not sound like a lot of time, but when this trinket is on a 1.5-minute cooldown, that's kind of insane. You can plan around that trinket a little bit if you want to min-max, and it's going to be great for anyone who loves haste, which I think is quite a few plate users, right? It's probably going to be great for a handful of tanks too. I am a little sad to see this kind of effect be reused so quickly, but I guess the plate users weren't really the ones playing with it, which makes it a teeny bit better. But it makes me worry that the dev team is running out of ideas to make these trinkets feel different than something we've already seen before. Onto the Agility Trinket. Invocation of Yulon is the Agility Trinket, which works in more or less the same way it would seem, deals damage to enemies, split of course, but deals extra damage if you hit multiple baddies. They're also on a 1.5-minute cooldown, which I think is way more fun than the 2 or 3 minute or even longer cooldown trinkets, because you get to use them way more often, which both feels much better in my opinion, but also gives you a chance to line them up with a variety of cooldowns. The next Agility Trinket is Kimball's Razor Claw. Your damaging attacks have a chance to claw your target, causing them to bleed for 6 seconds. If you manage to claw someone from behind, I mean, I'm not going to judge you if you try, you do you, but if you pull it off, you'll also leech for 50% of the damage done. I can't imagine that leech will ever be worth actively going for unless you're on a fight with constant AoE damage, but I guess if you're a rogue, you're probably back there anyways, doing nasty rogue things. I would say this falls into the same category as the Strength Frost Damage of a Time Trinket, fairly boring but might be useful if it does enough damage. Honestly, those are the most lackluster trinkets to me. It doesn't really matter how it works, whether you deal damage over time, upfront damage, bleed damage, frost damage. If it's simply a case of equipping the trinket because it's a passive effect and the end result is more damage, that's a fairly boring trinket in my opinion. And here we go again with a long name, as the Variable Intensity Gigavolt Oscillating Reactor. Here's another agility trinket, and I swear at this point they just want to try to say these names 10 times faster in between pulls during the raid night. 10 gold to the chap who lasts the longest. This one works in a bit of a different way from the Strength Gigavolt contraption. Your crit increases by 110 every 2 seconds, capping at 660 crit for 6 seconds, and then decreases and turns off for 6 seconds, and you cycle through that every 32 seconds. It's basically the mage talent Incanter's Flow, which does the same thing, but it's a straight up damage increase. I would love for this trinket to be intellect instead of agility, just to see those two effects stack, but alas, the agility users will get to have some fun this time around. While the effect isn't really that new, it's at least more interesting than a fully passive damage increase, and if you can time your hard-hitting abilities to go off during the high crit phases, you can squeeze out some more extra damage by playing well. But the trinket actually has an on-use effect too, which allows you to maintain the current crit value for another 6 seconds. If you can time this right, you could keep that full crit stack for just under 12 seconds, again giving you a DPS boost for playing well. I think that's a fresh twist on an effect we've seen quite a few times in BFA already. Let's finish up with the healer and tank trinkets, starting with the healers. The Mirror of Entwined Fate gives you Intellect as a passive, which has an on-use effect that restores a good chunk of health to your target, but inflicts a curse upon yourself that absorbs a smaller amount of healing on yourself. It sounds like the Disc Priest's Shadow Mend, but instead of the target getting the heal absorb, you get it instead. It's going to be interesting if the debuff is an actual curse, which can be dispelled instead of healed off, but the lesser amount can probably be cleared without too many issues. But on a 2-minute cooldown, that upfront heal has got to be something worth taking this trinket for, otherwise it's just another emergency heal with a drawback on a very long cooldown. The other healing trinket looks far more impressive, and it's actually another AoE trinket which works in the exact same ways, just for friendlies instead of enemies. You can apply a shield to up to 5 allies in a targeted area, which absorbs 45,000 damage. And remember, these numbers could be on the low end right now, so that shield could end up being quite a bit bigger, but the amount shielded is increased when you affect multiple allies. So if you're using this as a quick shield on a single target, it's going to lose a lot of its value, but if you can get that shield across all 5 targets, you might be able to take the brunt off of the next large AoE attack. I think this trinket will end up being quite powerful for the same reasons that Discipline Priests are heavily desired right now. Absorption shields are always valuable, and this trinket gives every healer in your raid another mini healing cooldown on a 2-minute cooldown. That could be huge for raid encounters if each healer had their own trinket, and it has a lot of potential in Mythic Plus 2 where the shield can always hit your entire group in preparation for anticipated damage. This is definitely another one I'm looking forward to seeing in action. Those are the 2 healer-only trinkets, but remember that healers can pick up any of the other int trinkets as well. As for the tank-only trinkets, the first one is called One Sandy's Bargain. Being a tank item, both agility and strength users can equip it, and this one basically gives you a cheat death passive effect. It will absorb up to 76k from an attack that would have killed you, instantly heals you for about 58k, and then absorbs healing equal to 60% of the damage that triggered the effect. It also comes with a pretty hefty 6-minute internal cooldown. This could be great on progression when you get insta-gibbed by an attack you weren't prepared for, or could just lend itself well to any tank who isn't confident they're going to survive the entire fight without some extra help. The heal absorb also isn't a great deal, seeing as you get a decent chunk of health back to give your healers a chance to catch up. This could be useful, or it could be meh. I guess it depends on the tank. And the very last trinket to talk about is the Diamond Lace Refracting Prism. Every 10 seconds you gain an absorb shield which can stack 5 times. If you're off tanking, you should hopefully be able to stack that up to its full potential to take the edge off maybe the first swing that comes your way, but those numbers do seem a little low. But it could be useful in some situations, I guess. It could be even better if the absorb was bigger, but I think tanks tend to move towards less defensive trinkets as they become more comfortable with the encounters and as they gear up in general, and typically this kind of trinket doesn't scale well if it scales at all. So if you're a tank, maybe go back and look at some of the other agility as strength trinkets. Tank trinkets aren't really ever super exciting, which is a little sad. But that's all of the new trinkets up for grabs in the Battle of Dazar'alor raid. We'll probably see some numbers change here and there before the raid hits live servers, and we have quite a bit of time before that happens, so hopefully some of the lackluster ones should be improved. But I think the dev team did a pretty good job with most of these trinkets. They're definitely more interesting and have more potential at the very least than most of the trinkets from Uldir. What do you think from what you've seen so far? Do any of these trinkets interest you with how their effects could work? Are there any trinket effects you would love to see return? Leave all your thoughts in the comments section below. A big thank you to all of our supporters over on Patreon. You can see their names floating by on screen. If you want to join these lovely guys and gals, you can find a link in the description below. Remember to leave a like just below the video before you leave, and if you want to see more, make sure to subscribe. But apart from that, thanks for watching folks, good luck and have fun, and as always I will see you next time.